the 1st of September 1939, German forces invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Six months later, it was the turn of Norway and Denmark to fall under the Nazi jackboot. Then, on the 10th of May 1940, came the invasion of Holland, Belgium, and France. Holland succumbed in just a few days. Belgium fell in a little over 2 weeks. On the 14th of June, German troops entered Paris. 8 days later, France signed an armistice with the Germans. Thus, in the 15 months since the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, Hitler had made himself master of much of Europe. Only Britain now stood against him, with just the English Channel keeping the Germans at bay. The British were thankful at least that the bulk of their forces which had been fighting in France had escaped from Hitler's clutches. This was even though they had had to leave all their tanks and heavy weapons behind in France. A German invasion of Britain from across the English Channel now threatened. Yet British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was determined to fight on. Furthermore, he was also looking beyond the immediate and grave danger facing his country. To this end, he ordered the formation of the Commandos, specially trained groups of men which were to make lightning raids on German-held coasts. Churchill also looked to fan the flames of resistance in occupied Europe. The result was the formation in July 1940 of the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Its role was to wage subversive warfare through the organization of resistance groups to carry out sabotage against the German war effort within their countries. For this, agents needed to be inserted in order to coordinate the efforts of the resistance groups. These also had to be provided with weapons and explosives. A number of methods of insertion were used. Submarines were one means of transport, high-speed motor torpedo and motor gunboats another. Fishing vessels were also used. But some of the coasts of occupied Europe were difficult to land on from the sea. They were also heavily guarded. The aircraft, however, could avoid these two obstacles and deliver greater quantities of supplies. To this end, a special RAF flight, number 419, was formed in August 1940 to fly in agents. The flight initially operated from Stradishaw. Lying between Cambridge and Ipswich, its hangars still stand as a ghostly memorial. Number 419 flight was equipped with 2 Whitley bombers and a Westland Lysander. The flight carried out its first operation in September 1940, when it dropped Agent Philip Schneidau by parachute into France and extracted him the following month with its Lysander. The Westland Lysander itself had come into RAF service in 1938 as a reconnaissance and artillery spotting aircraft. Although it had a low top speed, it was very robust, and above all could land and take off in a very short distance. As such, it became the main means of inserting agents, especially into France. Number 419 flight soon moved to Newmarket Racecourse, the seat of British horse racing, and was enlarged into a squadron, number 138. Its Whitleys were replaced by more powerful Halifaxes. Hudsons were also allotted to it. These had a relatively short landing and takeoff distance and were used to land supplies and extract groups of agents and resistors. By this time, the demands on the Special Duties Squadron covered northern, eastern and western Europe and were growing. A second squadron was therefore formed. In spring 1941, Hitler had launched an attack on Yugoslavia and Greece. This brought the whole of the Balkans under Axis control, but created further resistance movements, which required external support. At the time, the British needed all their resources in the Middle East for their campaign against the Axis forces in North Africa. It was therefore not until March 1943, when the fighting here was almost over, that they were able to form a Special Duties Squadron, number 148, in this theatre to operate in the Balkans. This was initially equipped with the American B-24 Liberator and the British Halifax bomber. Many of the agents had to be inserted by parachute and hence had to learn this skill. Their practice jumps were done from barrage balloons. They jumped through a hole in the floor of the basket, since this was the means of exiting from the bombers in which they would fly. As for the Special Duties air crews, they had above all to be highly skilled in navigation, since their target was often a small field deep in the countryside. They flew operations on moonlit nights, since this made locating the dropping zone or landing strip easier. The overseas service of the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, was another means of giving hope to the peoples of occupied Europe. It was also used to notify the resistance groups when drops were about to take place. Coded messages were formulated by the SOE agents with the resistance. These were broadcast immediately after the evening 9 o'clock news.
Pacifique. Grand raid de l'aéronaval allié sur une concentration de transport japonais. Veuillez écouter maintenant des messages personnels.
Gabi, mange ta soupe, ma chérie.
Across the English Channel, each resistance group anxiously awaited its personal message.
Message très important pour le chef de Gaël. Attention, Il va pleuvoir bougrement ce soir.
When it was received, they knew that their drop was to take place that night. This also meant the end of a sometimes long wait by the agents themselves. From their safe house, they were taken to the Special Duties Airfield. On arrival, the agents were thoroughly searched to ensure that they had no incriminating evidence, such as British clothes labels, which would give them away to the Germans. They were then issued with their weapons, equipment, and false papers. After this, they would board their aircraft and take off into the unknown. Meanwhile, over on the continent, the reception group would make its way to the dropping point or landing strip. The aircraft itself would fly at low level across the English Channel to avoid radar detection. The reception group would be listening for the sound of the aircraft's engines. Once they heard them, they would illuminate the dropping zone with torches. These were laid out in an L shape in order to indicate wind direction and speed. If agents and supplies were to be dropped, it was normally done at an altitude of 500 feet. While this was close to the minimum safety height, it meant that chances of detection by the Germans were much reduced. Once the agents and supplies had landed, the reception group had to work hard and quickly. Parachutes had to be hidden, and weapons and explosives got away to a place of safety. Often agents needed to be extracted, as did resistance members with important intelligence, or who were on the run from the Germans. The Lysanders and Hudsons were used for this purpose, often taking in agents at the same time. In France alone, there were some 220 successful pickups during 1940 to 44. During preparations for the Normandy landings, the US 8th Air Force in Britain provided B-24 Liberators for special duties. These operated under SOE's equivalent, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. There was a sharp increase in the dropping of weapons and explosives, so that the French resistance could play its full part in ensuring the success of the Allied invasion. Everything had to be packed in special parachutable containers. French Special Air Service teams, called Kunis, were dropped to cut the rail links between Brittany and the Normandy invasion beaches. To monitor German troop deployments, 50 teams were also dropped under the codename Sussex. Finally, no less than 93 Jedburgh teams were dropped. Each consisted of an American, a Briton, and a Frenchman. Equipped with radios, their task was to coordinate the activities of the resistance groups and to ensure their resupply with weapons, ammunition, and explosives. Jedbras were used again in September 1944, when the Allies mounted a massive but ultimately unsuccessful operation to seize key bridges in Holland so as to get across the River Rhine and outflank the German defenses. Jedbras were also employed in Norway, just prior to the German surrender there in May 1945. Those who flew in the Special Duties squadrons operated under the strictest secrecy. They were among the very best pilots and navigators who displayed superlative airmanship. They received numerous decorations for their skill and courage. The agents whom they delivered were among the bravest of the brave. In December 1941, a small group of Czechs was flown from Britain and dropped by parachute into their country. Their mission was one from which they did not expect to return. It was nothing less than the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the German protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and one of the most ruthless of the Nazi hierarchy. But not until the following May did the opportunity present itself. On the 27th, Heydrich left his house in the Prague suburbs for work without his usual escort. Two of the Czech agents were waiting and threw a grenade which fatally wounded Heydrich. But the agents themselves were eventually trapped in a church. They took their own lives rather than fall into German hands. Another SOE target was the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork in Norway. This was producing heavy water for Germany's atomic bomb development program. On the night of the 22nd of January 1943, 6 Norwegian agents were dropped from a Special Duties Halifax onto the Hardanger Plateau, which lies west of Oslo and 30 miles from the target. They met 4 other agents who had been inserted earlier. The group then made its way to the plant and raided it. Such was their success that the German program was put back by 2 years. However, most SOE agents, and those controlled by the American OSS, had a seemingly less glamorous role, but one that was just as dangerous and demanded just as rigorous training. Their job was to create and nurture resistance networks, as well as to direct sabotage operations, so that they conform to overall Allied strategy. The agents usually operated in teams of 3. One was the organizer, who operated a circuit which coordinated the activities of local resistance groups. He needed a radio operator, so that he had contact with SOE headquarters in London. But within the occupied country itself, messages could often only be passed by word of mouth. It was too dangerous to use any other means of communication. For this, a courier was required. witness was often a woman, since they attracted less suspicion than men. The Germans were well aware of the resistance and that agents from Britain were helping it. They used every means possible to track down and arrest resistance members and SOE agents. Radio operators were especially vulnerable, since radio location vans became adept at pinpointing them when they transmitted messages. Those agents whom the Germans did catch could expect to be subjected to every form of brutal torture in order to force them to betray fellow agents and resistance members. The agents had to be on their guard 24 hours a day, for they never knew when the Germans or their minions might strike. Yet in spite of the dangers, there was no shortage of volunteers for this hazardous work. One SOE agent was Odette Sansom, a French woman who had married an Englishman in 1931 and was the mother of 3 girls. But such was her patriotism for her native country that she volunteered to become an SOE agent. In November 1942, Odette was landed in the south of France and successfully evaded the German forces stationed there. She was to act as courier for a resistance network run by Captain Peter Churchill. Both, however, were betrayed and captured. Odette falsely told her captors that her boss was related to the British Prime Minister and thereby saved his life. She herself was repeatedly tortured, but resisted all attempts to extract information from her. She was then sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, but still her indomitable spirit could not be broken. Odette was awarded Britain's highest civil award for bravery, the George Cross, and only died in 1995. Another in the same mold was Wing Commander Frederick Yo Thomas, whose code names were the White Rabbit and Shelley. He had begun his war as an interpreter before joining SOE. After 2 hazardous trips to France, Yo Thomas returned once more in February 1944 to try and spring a friend of his from prison. He was caught, tortured, and then flung into the horrors of Buchenwald concentration camp. He too survived, but others laid down their lives. Among these was another mother, Violette Jabot, who was dropped into France for the second time on the night of D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, to work with the Maquis organization. She and the local Maquis leader were ambushed by the SS Das Reich Panzer Division, which was on its way to Normandy. Violette twisted her ankle, but fought off the Waffen-SS men for 2 hours to enable her companion to escape. Running out of ammunition, she was forced to surrender, but again refused to talk in spite of the appalling brutalities inflicted on her. Like Odette, she was eventually sent to Ravensbrück. Here, her cheerfulness was an inspiration to all around her. Sadly, she was executed by the Gestapo in January 1945. Her many decorations for bravery were presented to her little daughter to hold in memory of her mother. The part played by the agents and others to fan the flames of resistance in occupied Europe made a vital contribution to the eventual Allied victory. Likewise, the special duty squadrons ensured that the resistance did not wither on the vine.